You're a lying thief. You think you can just steal money and get away with it? Before Kianna even realized what was happening, she was roughly pinned against the hood of the police car. Cold metal handcuffs closed around her wrists. The cops didn't ask questions. Yasti didn't let her explain herself. To them, she was already guilty. She was accused of being involved in a massive financial scam. Kianna Moore's world collapsed in an instant. The police claimed they had evidence, bank statements, CCTV footage, witness statements. Everything pointed to her. But there was one problem. She had nothing to do with it. What happened next stunned everyone. 15 days ago. Kianna was closing up her office after a long day of work. She worked at Capital Harvest, a non-profit organization that helps low-income families sustain themselves with fresh produce. The pay was modest, but she loved her job. It was sweltering outside, the air saturated with humidity. She hurried to her car, hoping her parking ticket hadn't expired yet. But no sooner had she gotten there than she saw the flashing lights of a police car. At first, Kianna thought she was just getting a parking ticket. But when officers Daniel Mills and Ava Rios got out of the car, she realized it was more serious than that. "Are you Kianna Moore?" Mills's voice sounded hard. Kianna nodded, sensing a growing unease. "You are under arrest on suspicion of fraud, identity theft, and financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent." She tried to object, to say it was a mistake, but no one was listening. Cold handcuffs closed around her wrists, and the world she knew crumbled. 3 days until the trial, Kianna sat in the office of her attorney, Max Williams, a public defender who worked in the basement of the old state building. Faded motivational posters hung on the walls, and the single lamp on the ceiling flickered, creating a sullen atmosphere. Max was an experienced lawyer who had seen many unjust cases. He scrutinized the papers the prosecutors had dumped on him. "They have too much circumstantial evidence," he frowned, pointing at the thick folders. "They make you out to be the central figure in the scheme. They claim you ran the entire fraud network, opened dummy accounts, and ran a complex financial fraud." Kianna turned pale. "But it's not true. I know. But they have bank deposits in your name, statements from people who claim you used stolen cards, stays, and phone records linking you to the suspects." Max rubbed his temple. "We need to find a lead. If their case was ironclad, they wouldn't be flooding us with this avalanche of paper. Somewhere in here there's a thread we can pull." She gripped the armrests of her chair, thinking of her mother and sister. If she was convicted, her life would be over. Max noticed her despair. "We'll fight, Kianna. We'll question every witness, every piece of evidence. We'll find the truth. I promise." She nodded, barely swallowing the lump in her throat. She couldn't afford to lose. Court day. The air conditioners in the courtroom were blowing cold air, but Kianna could still feel drops of sweat running down her back. As she stepped into the marble lobby of the building, she felt like all eyes were on her. Her mother, Denise Moore, paced beside her, clutching a small Bible in her hands. Her younger sister, Danielle, glared angrily at the reporters who were trying to get close. Max was waiting for them at the elevators with an armful of documents. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Kianna took a deep breath. As ready as she could be. They went up to the 3rd floor, where the judge was already waiting for them. But what Kianna didn't yet know was that on this day, An unexpected witness would enter the courtroom that would turn the case upside down. Judge Rebecca Deckway, strict and uncompromising, but known for her fairness, was to preside over the trial. Kianna had only heard sketchy things about her, but now prayed her reputation would live up to her. As she entered the courtroom, her heart pounded faster. The wooden spectator benches, the towering judge's desk, the U.S. court seal on the wall, it all seemed unreal. She took a seat at the defense table, glancing at Max for support. On the other side was the prosecution team, 2 men and 1 woman. They were led by Assistant District Attorney Heather Langs, an ambitious lawyer who was said to be aiming for higher office. Sitting next to her were officers Mills and Rios. Mills smirked smugly, and Rios twirled her pen nervously in her hands. Kianna felt fear come over her in waves. These men were confident, too sure of themselves. The trial began with the prosecution's opening statement. Lang confidently approached the jury, which was still made up of only candidates. "Good morning, Your Honor. Good morning to all present," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Today we are trying a case of major financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The defendant, Miss Kianna Moore, orchestrated a massive counterfeit credit card scheme, defrauding dozens of citizens, banks, and businesses of thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars." Lang walked over to a large screen mounted next to the prosecution table and switched slides. Images of credit cards, bank statements, and ATM footage appeared on the screen. Although the images were blurry, they made for an impressive picture. "We have irrefutable evidence that Miss Moore, Saksho, along with her accomplices, stole identities, opened fictitious accounts, and personally profited from these crimes. The question is not whether she is guilty, but how thoroughly and knowingly she carried out this deception." After these words, the courtroom fell silent for a moment. Kianna felt her face burning. "Brain center," she whispered, shocked. This sounded absurd. Max stood up, buttoned his jacket, and approached the jury. His voice wasn't as bombastic as Lang's, but he sounded genuinely convinced. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution calls Ms. a brilliant criminal. But ask yourself, what evidence do they have? What we will see today is a collection of circumstantial evidence and contradictory testimony. We will remind you that the burden of proof is on the prosecution. They must prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." He paused, looking around at the faces in the room. "There are serious inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, and we will expose them. We will prove that Miss Moore is not the perpetrator, but the victim of a mistake, or perhaps something far worse." Finished, Max sat down and the questioning of the prosecution witnesses began. The first to speak was the store owner, Ax, who claimed that Kianna had bought nearly $1,000 worth of gift cards from him using a stolen card. Next was a bank teller who stated that he had seen Kianna deposit large sums of money into several accounts over a 2-week period. Each time Max got up, a precise and methodical cross-examination followed. "Are you absolutely sure it was Ms. Moore?" he asked the cashier. "Did you see her face in person, or are you relying on the photo the police showed you?" The cashier hesitated. "Yep. I think it was her." Max moved closer. "Is there any security footage that might confirm your memory?" The cashier glanced nervously at Lang. "Footage from that week's?" "Oh, they've been re-recorded." Max nodded. "Got it. So we have no hard evidence, just your vague recollection. // thank you." The shopkeeper spoke next. The customer seemed nervous, avoided eye contact. It seemed suspicious to me, he said. Max bowed his head. People can be nervous for all sorts of reasons, Mr. Fletch. How long did your meeting with the alleged perpetrator last? A few minutes. So after those few minutes, and after talking to the police, you're sure it was Ms. Moore? Well, yes. They showed me her photo. So your identification is based on a photo lineup arranged by law enforcement? Yeah. Max raised an eyebrow slightly, letting the courtroom realize the weakness of the testimony. But despite the obvious gaps in the evidence, the prosecution continued to ramp up the pressure. They presented mountains of documents, streams of witnesses, increasingly trying to drown Kianna under the weight of evidence. When Officer Mills was called to the stand, Kianna clenched her fists. There was a swagger about him that bordered on arrogance. The impeccably pressed uniform, the arrogant smile, he acted as if the outcome of the trial was a foregone conclusion. Officer Mills, Lang began. Tell the court how you began your investigation of Ms. Moore. Point. He coughed and answered confidently. We were tracking a wave of counterfeit card fraud. During the course of the investigation, traced Ms. Moore's name came up repeatedly, in suspicious accounts, in tips from informants, in witness identifications. He paused, letting the audience digest what he had said. When the evidence became strong enough, we requested an arrest warrant. Kianna gritted her teeth. He made it sound like their case was flawless. Where's the real evidence? Lang smiled. What specific role do you think Ms. Moore played in this scheme? Make this text coherent in meaning and more engaging. This is the second part of one big text. Then there will be other parts. They need to be built logically, so that one text follows from the other, and in the end it turned out to be one big story. All text should be in Russian. Write the text not in chat. The trial of Kianna Moore continued, and the tension in the hall was growing. Financial expert Daniel Corbett stepped confidently to the podium, fixed his tie, and began to explain how the fraudulent scheme had been identified. After analyzing multiple transactions from the stolen cards, he said, we matched the timestamps of the purchases to ATM surveillance footage. In several instances where a person wearing a hoodie or baseball cap entered the ATM rooms minutes after these transactions. We believe that person was Ms. Moore. Point. Max stood up abruptly. Objection? Your Honor, the witness is making a direct identification without probable cause. Judge Delakawa raised an eyebrow slightly and nodded. Objection sustained. Mr. Corbett, you may state your findings, but refrain from making personal identifications unless you have hard evidence. Corbett nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Let me be clear. In all the cases analyzed, the same phone number was used to set up SMS notifications on the accounts. That number is registered to Ms. Moore's address. Kianna's heart raced. She remembered how she had lost her phone a few months ago. Had someone used her number or transferred it to a new SIM card? She had told the police about it, but they seemed to have ignored her words. Prosecutor Lang showed graphs on the monitors illustrating how the transactions were linked to Kianna's number. Everything looked convincing. But Max noticed one important detail. There was no data about IP addresses and the device from which the transactions were conducted. During cross-examinations, Max went on the offensive. Mr. Corbett, are you aware that a phone number can be spoofed or transferred to another device using publicly available software? The expert hesitated. Yes, I mean, it's theoretically possible, but it's rare. Did you check to see if Ms. Moore could have lost control of her number? There is no such information in the billing records, Corbett replied, clearly uncomfortable. Max grinned. But you didn't try to find out if that was the case, did you? Corbett's jaw tensed. We were analyzing the data we had. Thank you. Max turned around, leaving the jury with the impression that the prosecution had presented an incomplete picture. The next day, the prosecutor's office called several more witnesses, shopkeepers and bank employees. All of them repeated the same thing. They were sure they had seen Kianna. However, once Max took them into custody, the certainty began to falter. Memories were hazy, dates were confused. It became clear that the police were helping these witnesses identify Kianna based on a limited set of photographs. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Kianna overheard a tense conversation by chance. You better stick to your story, or you'll regret it, Officer Mills hissed. Officer Rios looked confused, almost frightened, but she didn't say anything, hastily disappearing into the ladies' room. Kianna was overcome with anxiety. What exactly was she afraid of? Later that day, the court clerk cautiously approached Max. There are classified statements in the case that were not introduced into evidence, he whispered. I overheard the prosecutors mentioning them. You should file a motion to disclose them. Max's eyes widened. Thank you. Are you sure? The clerk nodded and quickly left. Max immediately prepared a motion to disclose all classified testimony relevant to the case. Judge Delacroix scheduled a hearing on the matter for the next morning. The next day, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The gallery was filled with reporters and spectators. Rumors had already spread that the defense was going to challenge the prosecutor's office. Kianna entered the hall with her heart pounding and noticed Prosecutor Lang whispering with Mills and a representative of the district attorney's office. Their faces were tense. As soon as the hearing began, Judge Delacroix spoke. Mr. Williams, you claim that the DA's office is withholding potentially exculpatory evidence. Do you have any evidence? Max straightened up. A reliable source among the court staff said that there are classified affidavits that have not been included in the official file. If they pertain to Miss Moore, they may contain exculpatory information. Prosecutor Lang jumped in. Your Honor, we are not aware of any such documents. This is a baseless attempt to delay the trial. Judge Delacroix frowned. Nevertheless, the defense has the right to review material that may be exculpatory. I will conduct an in-camera review of these documents. If they relate to Miss Moore's case, I will decide whether they are subject to disclosure. After a short recess, the judge returned to the room, her face expressing irritation. I have reviewed the documents and found an affidavit filed by an anonymous law enforcement officer. It alleges serious irregularities in Miss Moore's identification point. Specifically, some officers may have manipulated or even falsified witness statements. There was a muffled hum in the hall. Kianna felt her heart clench. Was this really the chance to prove her innocence? Therefore, the judge continued, I am lifting the secrecy on this document. Both parties will receive copies. In addition, I expect an immediate explanation from the prosecutor's office as to why this document was not provided earlier. Prosecutor Lang looked stunned. Your Honor, I didn't know about this document. This is clearly an internal police problem, not a willful concealment of evidence by my office. The judge looked at her coldly. It remains for us to determine whether this was a willful violation. I am giving the defense the opportunity to review the witness's testimony and subpoena them again. She banged her gavel, and the hall exploded with whispers. It was a watershed moment in the Kianna Moore case. The trial was adjourned until the next day, but the air seemed electrified in anticipation of the coming upheaval. In Max's office, he and Kianna leaned over the declassified affidavit. The document was heavily redacted, but its substance was explosive. I observed some officers in the police department coercing or setting up witnesses to identify Kianna Moore as a suspect in a number of credit card fraud cases. Witnesses who doubted were persuaded to reconsider or repeatedly shown Miss Moore's photograph until they agreed. Some deposit slips allegedly signed by Ms. Moore were never verified by forensic handwriting experts, despite prescribed procedures. The document also referred to internal emails calling Kianna a convenient suspect and explicitly instructing her not to consider other leads. Kianna felt both relieved and angry at the same time. So they knew. She whispered, her voice shaking with rage. They knew it wasn't me, but they made me guilty anyway. Max put the affidavit on the table. It looked like it. The question is who wrote it and whether we can convince him to testify. Do you think he'll risk coming forward? Kianna swallowed. Max sighed heavily. It's hard to say. Whistleblowers in the police force are under pressure. But if we prove it's all true, we won't even need his testimony. This document gives us a strong argument. The whole investigation can be recognized as rigged. Kianna wiped away her tears. Thank you. I was beginning to lose hope. We still have a battle ahead of us, but now we have a path to follow. Armed with new evidence, Max got officers Mills and Rios subpoenaed back into court. Ada Lang objected vehemently, accusing the defense of delaying the trial, but Judge Delacqua ruled that under the circumstances, the re-examination was necessary. When Mills re-entered the courtroom, his self-confidence was visibly shaken. He looked tense, but tried to maintain an outwardly calm demeanor. Max immediately took the initiative. Officer Mills, are you aware of the internal order that designated Miss Moore as the prime suspect despite the lack of direct evidence? Max held out to him a printed excerpt from the affidavit. Mills's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not aware of any such disposition. Then how do you explain that this document explicitly states that you manipulated witnesses into identifying Ms. Moore? Mills tensed, cast a quick glance at Ada Lang, but she couldn't find anything to say. That document... It's anonymous. It doesn't prove anything. Maybe... Max nodded. But combined with your partner, Officer Rios, admitting that the identification procedure was broken, it's more than a coincidence. Isn't it? Mills shrugged. I was doing my job. No one forced anyone to do it. Max turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense requests that all internal emails and memos that referred to Miss Moore as a convenient suspect be submitted to the court. Judge Delacqua nodded. Officer Mills, you are required to turn over to the court all relevant documents. Immediately. Mills turned pale, but nodded. Officer Rios was called in for questioning next. She looked frightened, her hands shaking, her eyes darting around the room. Lang pressed her lips together, as if afraid of what Rios would say. Max slowly approached the witness stand. Officer Rios, you admitted earlier that standard identification procedures were not always followed. Is that correct? Rios nodded, her voice barely audible. Yes. Now, knowing about the affidavit, do you have any additional information as to why Ms. Moore became the prime suspect despite the lack of direct evidence? She cast a glance at Mills Arcus, who was gloomily watching her from the audience. After a long pause, she spoke. I had my doubts. She whispered. Some witnesses said the suspect was taller or larger than Ms. Moore, but Mills said that testimony was unreliable. After we got the tip on her phone number, all other theories just stopped being considered. There was a noise in the courtroom. Max moved closer. Are you saying that Officer Mills willfully ignored contradictory witness testimony? Rios squirmed, but nodded. Yes. He said it was necessary to close the case. There was a lot of pressure from above. When I tried to talk about the inconsistencies, he told me to keep quiet if I didn't want trouble. What about the deposit slips? Have you ever seen proof that Ms. Moore actually signed them? Rios brushed away tears. No. There was no handwriting analysis. We just assumed it was her signature because the bill was in her name. But her driver's license wasn't scanned at the bank. We didn't confirm her identity in person. There was a tense silence in the hall. Kianna clenched her hands, her heart pounding. Judge Delacqua looked angry. Ada Lang jumped up. Your Honor, objection. Officer Rios. The trial was adjourned until the next day, but the tension in the courtroom was still palpable. In Max's office, he and Kianna scrutinized the declassified affidavit. The document was heavily redacted, but the gist was clear. I observed some police officers coercing witnesses into identifying Kianna Moore as a suspect in multiple cases of credit card fraud. Witnesses who doubted were persistently advised to reconsider their statements or to repeatedly see Ms. Moore's photograph until they agreed with the investigator's version of the story. The deposit slips allegedly signed by Miss Moore were never confirmed by forensic handwriting analysis, despite internal regulations requiring such testing in cases of major fraud. Kianna felt both relieved and furious at the same time. So they knew, she whispered, her voice shaking with anger. They knew it wasn't me. But they made me guilty anyway. Max laid the document on the table, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the edge of the paper. From the looks of it, that's the way it is. The question is who wrote it and whether we can get him to testify. Do you think he'll risk going public? It's hard to say. Whistleblowers on the force risk a lot. But maybe we don't even need him to testify in person. If we can prove his allegations are true, it'll seriously undermine the prosecution. Thank you. Kianna struggled to hold back her tears. I was beginning to lose hope. Max squeezed her hand for support. We still have a fight ahead of us, but now we have the opportunity to completely destroy their accusation. Armed with that affidavit, Max demanded that Officers Mills and Rios be called back in for more questioning. Prosecutor Ada Lang protested, accusing the defense of theatrics, but Judge Delacqua ruled that given the new document, the witnesses needed to be heard again. As Officer Mills took his seat at the podium, his confidence evaporated. Max approached him and began his questioning. Officer Mills, are you familiar with the internal order from your department that mentioned Ms. Moore as a priority suspect despite the lack of direct evidence? Mills pressed his lips into a thin line. I am not aware of any such directive. Max silently unfolded the printed fragment of the affidavit and held it closer. Then explain why this document says your department knowingly manipulated witness testimony? Mills blushed and cast a quick glance at Ada Lang, but she looked equally confused. This document. It's anonymous. No name/no context. It's not evidence. Maybe. Max agreed. But when you compare it to the testimony of your partner, Officer Rios, who admitted that standard identification procedures were not followed, the picture becomes clear. Doesn't it? Mills clenched his fists. I was doing my job. No one forced anyone to do it. Your honest opinion is not evidence, Max parried. Unlike internal correspondence that refers to Ms. Moore as a convenient suspect. I asked the court to order Officer Mills to produce all internal emails and memos pertaining to Ms. Moore. Point Judge Delacqua nodded. Officer Mills produced the requested materials. Mills's face tensed, but he forced himself to answer. Yes, Your Honor. Officer Rios was then called back into the room. She looked distressed, her hands shaking. Max approached her. Officer Rios, earlier you admitted that the photo identification procedure was violated. Do you have anything to add? She glanced at Mills, who was looking at her with obvious menace. After a long pause, she whispered, I had my doubts. Some witnesses said the perpetrator was taller and larger than Ms. Moore, but Mills claimed they were wrong. When we got the information about her phone number, all other theories stopped being considered. There was dead silence in the room. Are you saying that Officer Mills deliberately ignored evidence that could have proved Ms. Moore's innocence? Max clarified. Rios nodded, holding back tears. Yes. In the hallway after the hearing, Max and Kianna were approached by a tall man in a strict suit. He was accompanied by two others. Agent Robert Mitchell's U.S.S. Secret Service Financial Crimes Division. We're working on the case of a large group of fraudsters stealing the identities of citizens. Miss Moore's name came up in our database, but not as a suspect, as a victim. Kianna froze. Victims? She barely audibly repeated. Mitchell nodded. Your phone number has been compromised as a result of a data breach. We believe a criminal group used it to open fake accounts. We have evidence to prove that you were physically in a completely different location during many of the transactions. Max couldn't help but smile in relief. We'll continue the hearing tomorrow morning. Are you ready to testify? We'll do more than that. We have evidence that should completely exonerate you. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Max called Agent Mitchell to the witness stand. Prosecutor Ada Lang objected, police, but the judge overruled her objection. Our evidence shows Mitchell began, that Ms. was the victim of a data breach. Her personal information was used to create fake accounts in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York. Local police claim she physically made these transactions, but our timeline shows otherwise. He inserted a thumb drive into the court system, and surveillance footage appeared on the screen. One showed a woman at an ATM in Philadelphia, another a similar hooded figure in Baltimore. Kianna gripped the edge of the table. She knew this was her chance for salvation. Make this text coherent in meaning and more engaging. This is the sixth part of one big text. Then there will be other parts. They need to be built logically, so that one text follows from another, and in the end it turned out to be one big story. The whole text should be in Russian. Write the text not in chat. The banging of the judge's gavel sounded deafening. All charges against Ms. Moore are dismissed with prejudice, Judge Delacqua announced. Her complete rehabilitation will be recorded in court. In addition, I strongly recommend that the Department of Justice and Internal Affairs conduct a thorough review of the police actions in this case. Her stern gaze stopped first on Officer Mills, Ors, who cringed in his seat, and then on Rios, who kept her eyes on the floor. We cannot tolerate law enforcement behavior that undermines justice and leads to false accusations. The final blow of the gavel. Case dismissed. Chaos ensued in the courtroom. Some cheered, others resented. Half the reporters rushed toward Kianna, microphones pointing at her face. The other half besieged Ada Lang and Officer Mills, eager for their comments. Kianna felt her mother hug her, sobbing in relief. Her sister Daniela joined in the hug. Max, who had held firm throughout the case, now made no secret of his emotions. "Justice has been served," he whispered, patting Kianna on the back. The sunlight outside the courthouse seemed especially warm. Kianna inhaled a full breath. She had just gotten out of the darkest period of her life. "How do you feel now?" one of the journalists asked. Kianna swallowed, then said firmly, "Relief. Gratitude to Agent Mitchell and the Secret Service for bringing the truth to justice. But also anger. Anger that I was here at all. Anger that the local police chose me as a scapegoat." "Will you be filing a lawsuit against the police department?" came another question. Kianna glanced at Max. He nodded faintly, indicating that it was an option worth considering. "I'll think about it," she answered firmly. "I've lost my job, my peace. My reputation tried to be destroyed. Something has to change to prevent that from happening again." The scandal rocked the police department. Internal investigations revealed that Officer Mills repeatedly ignored exculpatory evidence to increase his clearance rates. He was suspended from the force, and rumors claimed he was facing obstruction of justice charges. Officer Rios, in an attempt to redeem herself, cooperated fully with the investigation. Her willingness to testify against Mills may have mitigated her punishment, but her police career was over. She resigned, citing personal reasons. Ada Lang also suffered the consequences. Though she claimed she didn't know about the hidden evidence of Mars, the public demanded justice. The prosecutor's office came under pressure due to a lack of police oversight. Lang remained in her post, but her once brilliant career was marred by scandal. Captain Holcroft, Haas, who had previously proudly proclaimed on television that the case had been solved, hastily left his post. Technically, he had resigned, but everyone understood he had been forced. Kianna was free, but her wounds remained. She suffered from panic attacks, nightmares about the detention cell. Her community, however, supported her. People who had previously doubted her innocence now realized how dangerous it was when the system went off course. Working for a non-profit organization gave her a chance to get back to her life. Handing out fresh produce, teaching low-income families about nutrition. These small but important tasks made her feel part of the world again. But she couldn't forget what had happened. On Max's advice, Kianna began speaking at colleges, community centers, and justice reform forums. She talked about how easy it was to be victimized by the system, the nightmare of prison, and what it was like to wait for the truth to finally come out. At one such event, Agent Mitchell spoke alongside her. Kianna Moore's story is an example of how a stolen identity can cost a person everything, he said. We must demand honesty and cooperation from law enforcement. Kianna smiled, though the memories of the trial were still fresh. I hope my experience will help others, she said. No one should have to go through what I went through. A few months later, Kianna filed a civil suit against the city and the police department for wrongful arrest, malicious prosecution, and violation of her civil rights. City officials were quick to offer a settlement, not wanting to take the case to trial, which would put the police in jeopardy again. Kianna didn't want just money. She demanded change, better training for officers, mandatory oversight of financial crime investigations, and transparent interactions with federal agencies. Negotiations lasted weeks, but eventually the city agreed. In addition to large monetary compensation, shine reforms were enacted to reduce the likelihood of similar cases in the future. Police officers were now required to undergo specialized training in identity theft investigations, and the process of identifying suspects became more objective. These measures couldn't erase her suffering, but Kianna found comfort in the fact that her ordeal had led to something important. One warm spring day, she once again stood on the courthouse steps. This time she was not here under compulsion. She had come to address young lawyers and students at a symposium on justice reform. Looking around, she remembered the day of her trial. The stiff camera flashes, the fear of an uncharted future. Things were different now. She was no longer the accused. She was the voice of change. Kianna walked up the courthouse steps, but now her heart didn't clench with fear. She wasn't a defendant, not waiting for a verdict that could ruin her life. Today, she was here as a guest, as someone whose story had come to symbolize the struggle for justice. Waiting for her inside were panelists Max Williams, a representative from the Department of Justice, and several local leaders and activists. The discussion centered on reforms to the justice system, the need for greater collaboration between local and federal agencies, and prosecutors' ethical obligations to the law and the community. When it was Kianna's turn, she took a deep breath and looked around at those gathered. Their eyes read interest, and some were clutching pens, ready to take notes. She knew her words would not be idle. I've been on the other side of the system, and she began, and the room fell silent. I've learned how one wrong assumption, one mistake in identification can ruin a life. Justice should be based on truth, not on the pursuit of closure at all costs. When police officers compromise their conscience, when prosecutors ignore obvious inconsistencies, lives are ruined. She was silent for a moment, allowing the audience to consider her words. Then continued. But I also learned that the system can fix itself if enough people demand it. I stand before you as proof that truth can prevail. I hope my story reminds you, future lawyers and leaders, that justice is not about wins and losses. It's about the search for truth. The hall erupted in applause. Kianna caught Max's eye. He nodded proudly. In that moment, she felt something strange, a mixture of gratitude and determination. Her path had not been easy, but it had brought her here, to a new purpose, to a new meaning. After the event, Kianna walked out of the building and stopped at the top of the steps. The once formidable building didn't seem hostile to her now. It had become a symbol of change. A symbol that even in the darkest system light could break through. A light breeze ruffled her hair. Kianna looked around the courtyard, remembering everything, the arrest, the endless interrogations, the horror of her imprisonment, her mother's pain, her shame in public. And finally, the moment when the truth was revealed. There was a voice behind her. Miss Moore May I ask you a question? She turned around. The reporter and cameraman already had their cameras pointed at her. Kianna thought for a moment, then smiled softly. I've learned that sometimes justice has to be fought harder than we could ever imagine, she said. But the fight is worth it. If my story changes even one life, then everything I've been through was not in vain. The reporter nodded, turning off the camera. Kianna continued down the courtyard, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She knew she couldn't forget this nightmare, but she also knew she had become stronger. She had survived the injustice and won. Her story, the story of Kianna Moore, was both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. She proved that power can be used to harm, but that courage and determination, backed by hard evidence, can change the course of justice. And now she was going forward, not as a victim, but as someone who had changed the system.